We're going to begin this video with a single question. It isn't some impossibly puzzling mystery that demands classified documents or a degree in PhD. In fact, it's surprisingly simple. Why did people across so much of the world abandon what may have been the most productive food system ever known, and then spend the next 2 centuries acting as if it had never existed? The deeper we looked, the stranger that question became. Early 19th century botanical surveys kept describing landscapes that sounded nothing like the forests we're familiar with today. Across different regions of the world, explorers repeatedly mentioned fruit trees, nut trees, medicinal plants, and countless edible species growing together in patterns that seemed far too organized to be random. Some even questioned whether Mother Nature alone could have arranged such order. From British surveyors to French naturalists, the descriptions barely changed. Men who had never met, writing in different languages and working thousands of miles apart, kept recording impossibly similar observations. That alone is difficult to dismiss. Then something else stood out. As the years passed, those accounts became harder to find. Forests that had once been described as rich sources of food slowly disappeared from official records. In their place came reports of cleared land, timber, plantations, and new settlements. Within only a few years, an entire way of shaping the landscape seemed to vanish without much explanation. Which leaves one question that history has never answered. What, exactly, was erased? Chapter 1. The legendary forest they erased. To answer that question, we're going to England, because there may not be a better place to begin. Not because the forests survived there, but because the records did. The story usually starts with the royal forests of medieval England. Most people hear that name and picture vast hunting grounds where kings rode through the trees chasing deer. That's certainly part of the popular story. But the more closely we examine surviving records, the less complete that explanation becomes. The Domesday Book of 1086, together with later forest surveys and legal records, paints a far more complicated picture. At their greatest extent, the royal forests are believed to have covered somewhere between a quarter and nearly a third of England. That is an insane amount of land to preserve if hunting alone was the objective. The laws protecting those forests were also remarkably severe. Hunting game without permission could bring blinding, mutilation, imprisonment, or even execution depending on the period and the offense. But the restrictions reached much further than animals. Timber couldn't simply be cut. Land couldn't be cleared at will. Farming, grazing livestock, or constructing buildings all faced strict controls. Looking at the regulations together, the intention seems to have been protecting the entire woodland rather than protecting a royal pastime. The old legal rights are very revealing. Medieval documents refer to privileges such as common of mast, common of pannage, and estovers. They weren't random customs. They carefully regulated how people could gather acorns, beech nuts, chestnuts, hazelnuts, browse, fallen wood, and selected branches without damaging the long-term health of the forest itself. Instead of exhausting the landscape, these rules encouraged harvesting while allowing the woodland to continue producing year after year. Whether those forests were intentionally designed as large-scale food systems remains debated. But the management practices surrounding them certainly raise intriguing questions. Then, everything began to change. Between roughly 1750 and 1850, Parliament passed successive enclosure acts that transformed much of rural England. Commons and shared woodland were gradually privatized, fenced, cleared, and converted into fields devoted to increasingly specialized agriculture. Millions of acres changed hands during that period. Communities that had relied upon common access for generations suddenly found themselves excluded from land that had once helped sustain everyday life. According to the conventional historical explanation, Enclosure represented modernization, improved efficiency, and rising agricultural productivity. That interpretation remains the mainstream view. Even so, another question naturally follows. What was lost when those older landscapes disappeared? Diverse woodland filled with edible trees and renewable resources gave way to fields growing far fewer species. Whether viewed as progress or not, the transformation fundamentally changed the relationship between ordinary people and the land around them. Food increasingly depended upon ownership, wages, markets, and cultivated fields rather than access to living forests. Now let's cross the Atlantic. Long before European settlement, many indigenous nations throughout North America had developed remarkably sophisticated ways of managing entire ecosystems. In the Pacific Northwest, around the Great Lakes, and especially throughout what is now California, landscapes were shaped through generations of careful observation rather than left untouched. The Kalapuya people of the Willamette Valley carried out controlled seasonal burning to encourage camas meadows, oak woodlands, and other valuable food sources. Farther east, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy became well known for the Three Sisters corn, beans, and squash, but agriculture formed only part of a much broader system. Nut trees, berry patches, medicinal plants, and productive woodland surrounded many communities, providing dependable harvests year after year. Early European visitors often struggled to describe what they saw. Many wrote that the countryside resembled a vast park or an enormous estate that appeared unusually well maintained. One British colonial observer describing the Carolina Piedmont during the late 17th century recorded groves of pecan, walnut, and chestnut trees spaced so evenly that they reminded him of an old English orchard. Whether every detail reflected deliberate cultivation is still debated among historians, but numerous early accounts describe landscapes that were clearly shaped by generations of human stewardship rather than untouched wilderness. Then those landscapes began changing. The change wasn't always gradual. As settlement expanded, forests were cleared, communities were displaced, and traditional ecological knowledge was steadily interrupted. By the time systematic American timber surveys were carried out during the 1880s, enormous stretches of woodland described only a few generations earlier had already disappeared. Even more difficult to replace was the knowledge that disappeared alongside them understanding which species strengthened one another, which trees produced the richest harvests over centuries, and how an entire forest could function as a reliable source of food instead of simply a source of timber. Whether every historical account tells the full story remains open to debate. Yet the pattern itself is difficult to ignore. Similar descriptions appear again and again before gradually fading from the historical record. That raises the same question we started with. Well, if forests like these once existed across so many parts of the world, why did they disappear so completely? Chapter 2. The strange pattern no one can explain. To better understand what may have happened, we need to travel somewhere far bigger than England. The Amazon changes this conversation in a way that's difficult to ignore because it forces us to question ideas that stood almost unquestioned for generations. For much of the 20th century, the dominant scientific view described the Amazon rainforest as an untouched wilderness, a vast natural ecosystem that had experienced little large-scale human influence before European arrival. That explanation appeared in textbooks, documentaries, and classrooms around the world. Over the past few decades, however, discoveries made across the basin have complicated that picture considerably. Beginning in the 1990s, researchers studying terra preta, or dark earth, uncovered something remarkable. Instead of the familiar nutrient-poor red tropical soil, they found unusually dark, fertile ground capable of supporting abundant plant life even after centuries of heavy rainfall. Studies have shown that this soil was not formed naturally. It contains charcoal, organic material, pottery fragments, animal remains, and thriving microbial communities that point toward deliberate human creation over long periods of time. Estimates vary widely, but several studies suggest Terra Preta may cover anywhere from a tiny fraction of the Amazon to thousands of square kilometers, while other researchers believe its influence could be even more extensive. Whatever the final number proves to be, the discovery alone suggests that large portions of the rainforest were carefully managed rather than simply occupied. Then another detail began attracting experts' attention. Areas containing Terra Preta often support very high concentrations of useful species. Brazil nut trees, cacao, peach palm, and numerous edible plants appear together far more frequently than researchers would normally expect by chance. Many archaeologists believe these patterns reflect centuries of intentional landscape management instead of untouched natural growth. Taken together, the evidence points toward something surprisingly sophisticated. Rather than isolated gardens scattered through the forest, parts of the Amazon may have functioned as enormous living food systems where people shaped entire ecosystems while allowing them to retain the appearance of natural woodland. Then everything changed. Following European contact, disease swept across the Americas with devastating consequences. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other introduced illnesses caused catastrophic population losses among indigenous communities. Depending on the region and the estimates used, some historians believe parts of the Amazon basin may have lost between 50 and 90% of their population within little more than a century. The people who carried generations of ecological knowledge disappeared with heartbreaking speed, leaving forests that gradually reclaimed the settlements hidden beneath them. Even so, another question refuses to die. If many of those productive landscapes already existed, if fruit trees, palms, and valuable species were already growing, why weren't they protected? Why weren't they expanded? Why were so many eventually cleared instead? The same question appears elsewhere. England's Enclosure Acts reached their greatest intensity between roughly 1750 and 1850. Across North America, indigenous managed lands were displaced during the late 18th and 19th centuries. During the rubber boom, large sections of the Amazon experienced another major wave of forest exploitation. Across parts of West Africa, colonial administrations dismantled many sacred groves and long-established woodland management systems. In South and Southeast Asia, British and Dutch land reforms encouraged the replacement of diverse forest ecosystems with plantation agriculture devoted to single commercial crops. Different governments, different cultures, different environments. Yet many of these transformations unfolded within a surprisingly narrow period of history. That does not automatically prove a single coordinated plan. Economic expansion, colonial policies, industrial demand, and changing ideas about agriculture all played important roles. Even so, the pattern remains difficult to overlook. Across multiple continents, landscapes that had supported remarkable biological diversity steadily gave way to systems built around ownership, extraction, and large-scale commercial production. Chapter 3. The knowledge that died. There's another piece of this puzzle that rarely receives the attention it deserves. A food forest cannot be built overnight. A chestnut planted from seed may need 30 to 40 years before reaching full production. Oaks often take 80 years or more to produce heavy crops of acorns. Pecans and walnuts demand decades of patience as well. That changes the way we think about these landscapes. Nobody plants them expecting to enjoy the greatest rewards themselves. They plant for children they may never meet, trusting that one generation will care for what another began. That means the real inheritance wasn't just the trees. It was the knowledge passed from one generation to the next. People learned which species thrive together, when to prune, when to harvest, how to encourage new growth, and how to keep an entire woodland productive without exhausting it. Once those communities were broken apart through displacement, disease, or changing land ownership, that understanding became far easier to lose than the forests themselves. Around the very same period, another development was unfolding. Botanical gardens began expanding across the world. Kew Gardens in London grew rapidly during the 19th century, while institutions in Kolkata, Java, Singapore, Sydney, and elsewhere collected thousands of valuable plant species. Their contribution to botany is undeniable. But one question still lingers. The trees were preserved. The seeds were catalogued. The species were carefully classified. But where was the knowledge explaining how entire living food forests functioned as complete systems rather than isolated specimens? The story of the American chestnut illustrates why that question matters. Before 1904, Castanea dentata dominated much of eastern North America. Historians estimate it accounted for roughly 1/4 of the region's hardwood trees. Indigenous communities depended on it for generations. Rural families gathered its nuts every autumn, livestock fed beneath its branches. And chestnuts became part of everyday life throughout the eastern United States. Then disaster struck. According to the historical record, a fungal blight introduced on imported Asian chestnut trees spread with devastating speed. By the 1940s, an estimated 4 billion American chestnut trees had been lost. One of the continent's greatest natural food sources disappeared within a single lifetime. Whether viewed as an ecological tragedy, an unfortunate accident, or something that carried even wider consequences, its disappearance marked the end of a food resource that had quietly sustained countless generations. So, was it done on purpose? Chapter 4. The evidence they left behind. The story doesn't end with old forests. It continues in old maps. Thousands of early surveys, hand-drawn maps, and regional descriptions from the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries still survive in museums, libraries, and digital archives. They aren't perfect documents, but they offer something valuable: a glimpse of landscapes before railways, industrial expansion, and large-scale development transformed them. Comparing many of those records with the same locations today reveals an interesting pattern. Again and again, early surveyors described extensive woodland where little remains today. In several places, they also mentioned unusually diverse forests filled with fruit-bearing trees, nut-producing species, and plants that local communities relied upon for food and medicine. Not every description agrees, and historians often point out that early mapmakers sometimes exaggerated, copied earlier sources, or simply made mistakes. Those are reasonable cautions. Even so, it becomes difficult to ignore when similar observations appear in documents produced by different people working years apart. According to several researchers, another possibility deserves consideration. What later visitors assumed were untouched forests may, in some areas, have been landscapes shaped gradually over centuries through careful management. They may not have looked like farms or orchards in the modern sense. Instead, they occupied the space between cultivated land and wilderness, a living system that blended naturally into the surrounding environment. Whether that interpretation proves correct remains an open question, but it fits surprisingly well with many historical accounts. One subject that often appears in discussions like these is Tartary, sometimes called Tartaria on older European maps. This topic attracts no shortage of speculation, so it's worth being careful. The historical evidence does not support the idea of a single forgotten global empire. However, many early maps of Central Asia, Siberia, and neighboring regions contain ecological notes, settlement descriptions, and regional details that later maps either simplify or omit. Why that happened is still debated. Changes in surveying methods, political priorities, and evolving cartographic standards all played a role, although some questions remain unanswered. Something else stands out. Agricultural publications from the 19th century devoted enormous attention to crop yields, soil improvement, land ownership, drainage, and farming efficiency. Yet discussions of large-scale woodland food systems appear surprisingly rare. That absence doesn't prove they were intentionally ignored, but it is noticeable considering how frequently earlier travelers described productive, managed landscapes. Perhaps the most intriguing clues survive in places few people think to examine. Across parts of England, the Welsh borders, and Ireland, ancient hedgerows still weave through the countryside. Many contain hazel, crab-apple, elder, wild plum, damson, cobnut, sweet chestnut, and other useful species growing together. Ecologists generally view hedgerows as valuable habitats shaped by centuries of farming, while some researchers have suggested they may also preserve fragments of much older planting traditions. Whatever their original purpose, they feel like echoes from another way of working with the land. Not a complete picture, just enough to remind us that history sometimes leaves its strongest evidence in the quietest places. Chapter 5. The question that changes everything now. We want to say something before bringing this journey to a close. We're not asking anyone to believe that a forgotten empire ruled the world or that every historian has overlooked some enormous secret. The available evidence simply doesn't allow conclusions that's certain. What it does allow is a closer look at questions that deserve far more attention than they usually receive. Over the course of this investigation, we've followed old surveys, archaeological discoveries, botanical research, historical records, and traditional ecological knowledge preserved by indigenous communities. None of those pieces tells the complete story on its own. Yet when they're placed beside one another, they reveal a picture that feels far richer than the simple narrative many of us were taught. Across several parts of the world, people once understood how to work with forests rather than against them. They encouraged useful species, cared for productive landscapes over generations, and created systems capable of providing food while allowing those environments to remain remarkably resilient. Modern research into terra preta, ancient agroforestry, and long-term woodland management continues to uncover examples of that relationship. Perhaps the greatest loss wasn't a particular forest or even a particular tree. Perhaps it was the quiet disappearance of knowledge that took centuries to build and only a handful of generations to forget. Many protected forests still hold unanswered questions. Scientists continue studying them, archaeologists continue making discoveries, and new proof appears almost every year. That tells us this story is still unfolding. So maybe the question isn't whether our ancestors knew something great. Maybe it's how much of that understanding is still waiting to be rediscovered. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the past is rarely as simple as it first appears, and sometimes the oldest ideas turn out to be the ones worth finding again. Well, if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.